Please stand and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good morning and welcome to our regularly scheduled Thursday morning meeting. My name is Andy Hunthausen. To my left is not Commissioner Murray. He's ill today and I hope getting better. And to his left is Nicole Nisbet, our recording secretary, George Thabarge, our planning director. To my right is Commissioner Susan Good-Giese, and to her right is Deputy County Attorney Michelle Peterson-Cook and Eric Bryson, our Chief Administrative Officer. We have what looks to be a short agenda, but an important presentation today. There are no consent action items and no regular action items, but we have George Thabarge here today to give us an update on the county growth policy. A presentation on how things are going and where we stand at this time. So welcome, George.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Good-Giese. I'm here this morning to do a presentation on the project being done to update the county growth policy, which was last updated in 2004 during a time of development boom. And that plan set forth the goal to establish area plans for 6 regions of Lewis and Clark County. Those being Augusta, Lincoln, Wolf Creek Craig, Marysville, Canyon Creek, Canyon Ferry, and Helena Valley. In this project, which is being done under the oversight of the City County Planning Board with assistance from a planning consultant, Land Solutions LLC, we are focused on Helena Valley of those planning areas. The issues in Helena Valley are substantially different than these other planning areas. And the biggest difference is the fact that 95% of the county's population and about 98% of the development activity occurring within the county is in this one planning region around the city of Helena and its environs. During that last decade, extending from 2000 to 2010, the county approved for development purposes over 6,000 units of housing. That's an average of about 600 per year. During the start of that decade, it was much faster, and then during the beginning of the Great Recession, obviously the last few years it slowed down substantially, but the average for the entire decade was about 600 per year. The graphic that you see before you shows the Helena city limits in blue, their urban standards boundary in red, as well as East Helena's boundary and its growth area for consideration. And each of those icons represents a new addressing point. The county does not issue building permits, so the way that we track new housing starts is through the GIS system of adding addressing points. Of those 6,000 housing units, we estimate that about 5,000 were actually constructed and another 1,000 subdivision lots were platted and approved for development and assigned addresses. Our first key point, and as I go through this presentation, what I'm going to do is give you key points from the report that we've just completed. And the first key point in terms of looking at the growth and development is that issue of this is where most of the development activity is occurring. Looking at the census results, we see that in the area just north of and around East Helena, I'll point it out here, the Helena Valley Southeast census designated place. It's not incorporated, but it is recognized as a geographic entity. There are now over 8,000 people living around East Helena. The West Valley, West Central, has just under 8,000, and then north of Lincoln Road, there are now over 6,000 people living. So what we've observed in terms of the development patterns is that those areas of the Helena Valley are suburbanizing and in some cases urbanizing, as we'll show you in this presentation. And our second point is that population growth has been focused in small areas of the valley, and those areas have changed from rural to suburban and urban, and are likely to continue that trend under current circumstances. We did population projections looking at 3 different models. The first one you see in blue is the historic growth rate over the past 2 decades. The area's population has increased about 2% per year. This is outside of the city limits. And if that were to continue for the next 2 decades, you'd be looking at adding approximately 18,000 people to the population of the valley. More conservative estimates, one used by the state of Montana, looks at the aging population, which has a dampening effect on population growth for obvious reasons, and that shows an increase of about 7,000. We're thinking that the most conservative and logical estimate is one done by a firm called Woods and Poole. They're projecting about 10,000, recognizing the effects of migration and the energy boom, although obviously that's a question in terms of whether that will continue to be the stimulus that it has been. But we think that the most conservative estimate of what is likely to happen over the next 2 decades is about 10,000 people moving in and building about 4,000 new housing units, which last decade, as I said, about 5,000 units were built. So we think it's a fair and conservative estimate. Our assessment of the situation after reviewing this for 2 years is that the current growth policy of Helena Valley calls for the county to manage growth, to establish urban, transitional, and rural areas with development plans to guide orderly growth. That's what the current policy calls for. Unfortunately, rather than managing growth, according to the growth policy, the county has let the State Department of Environmental Quality determine development densities. And what we've seen is that throughout the valley, under the state DEQ minimum lot size rules, high-density subdivisions with lots as small as 7,000 square feet were developed in rural areas that lack infrastructure and public services to support such urban development patterns. And we see the need to, because the current growth policy is inadequate and ineffective to properly manage growth that is happening in Helena Valley, we see a need to address that in an update to the growth policy. We have identified 5 key issues that are of concern. The first being the availability of water for development. Along with that, wastewater disposal, road conditions and congestion are of obvious importance, as well as fire protection. We started out with those 4, but through the process that we went through, which I'll explain in a few minutes, we added floodplain development as a major issue. Now, I'm going to walk you through each of those in terms of some of the research that we've prepared and some of the conclusions that we've drawn. The first on water availability is that there are parts of the valley where there is simply not enough water in the aquifers to sustain the level of development that has been occurring. And this is a cross-section prepared by a hydrologist, a geologist actually, that shows in the valley there are 3 basic types of aquifers. The first is the sand and gravel aquifer, or alluvium aquifer they call it technically, and that is kind of like an underground lake. It's a large volume of water, readily passes, and if you put a well in that aquifer, you're likely to have all the water you could ever want.
What's the depth on that?
I'm sorry, the depth? In some places, it's 5 feet from the surface, and in other places, it's down at greater depth. I'm not a geologist to be able to describe to you the technical details. We can get that information. But generally, it is an area of extensive water supply, underground water supply. As you move up onto the benches around, and that's in the valley floor, as you move up onto the benches around the valley floor, there are tertiary sedimentary deposits and tertiary aquifers within those, contained within those, and just in a layman's term, those are kind of like more like ponds underwater as opposed to one large lake. Then when you get up into the hills around the benches and the valley floor, you get into the bedrock aquifer systems, and again, just to help people understand the dynamics and quality of that, it's like underground creeks, cricks, as you call them, found within the fissures and cracks within the rock system. And getting a good well there is a hit or miss proposition, depending upon where those cracks are and how deep you have to go to hit them. So those are the three types of aquifer systems. This is a map prepared by the Water Quality Protection District that shows on a plan view that Helena Valley aquifer, which is part of the reason it has so much water is that it is recharged by the irrigation canal that goes around the valley. The leakage from that, along with flows from the streams and rainfall percolating down into that aquifer, that has a sustained water supply, in part charged by the Missouri River. As you get out into these tertiary aquifer areas, particularly on the East Bench, in the North Hills, and over in the scratch gravels, we've seen some problems that we're going to explain to you. And our conclusion overall is that the only aquifer system with enough recharge to be assured of a sustainable water supply for high-density development is the Helena Valley Sandanet gravel or alluvial aquifer. And one of the key points is that the system that's currently in place for the review of new subdivisions is failing to ensure that the residents of the county have access to a reliable source of water. And I'll explain why we conclude that. There have been some fairly extensive groundwater studies done, the first one being one by the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology in the North Hills, which was precipitated by a complaint being filed with the DNRC by 30 property owners who claimed that their wells had gone dry by pumping from subdivisions occurring in those areas. They did an extensive study over a period of multiple years, and the conclusion that they came to, and I'll just make one quotation from that report, it said, if development continues from 2009 to 2014 in the same way that it did from 2005 to 2009, it's estimated that 32% of the wells in a portion of that area they designated as pumping center A will become unusable, and drawdown of 45 feet of the groundwater table would cause 50% of the wells to become unusable. So what they observed was that in these areas, here's a 80-acre plot here with a couple of hundred units of housing on it. And that is an example of the type of development that they concluded was drawing down the water table in the North Hills. So we've seen documented scientific evidence that pumping of groundwater by high-density subdivisions in the North Valley has caused neighboring wells to go dry. Now, what they projected about what would happen if the trends continued through 2009 through 2014 didn't happen, actually, because of the Great Recession. And those types of developments did not proceed at the rate that they were because of that. A similar study was done on the scratch gravels, again, with concerns of development's impacts on groundwater supplies. The Scratch Gravel Hills study was also done by the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology in cooperation with the Water Quality Protection District of Lewis and Clark County. And they did an analysis of a parcel that is 330 acres in size. And they did testing and modeling to look at the difference in the impacts on the groundwater of developing 33 10-acre lots on that subdivision property versus doing 267 1-acre lots. These were actual development proposals that were put before the planning board and the commissioners. And the hydrological modeling indicated that in the 10-acre density scenario, they predicted that the groundwater table would drop 7 feet, but that it would stabilize over time. With the 267 lot density scenario, they predicted that the groundwater table would drop over 50 feet and would not stabilize over time. And so the conclusion they made was, again, a quote from the study: groundwater modeling indicates that if bedrock aquifers were used to supply water to high-density subdivisions, noticeable groundwater declines would likely occur. So we see on the west side modeling indicating that groundwater levels would also be dropping if it were not for the low-density development that has happened there. And over that area, it has been an average density of about 10-acre lots. On the east side of the valley, we have not an extensive study, but we do have both anecdotal as well as in-depth scientific analysis of some of the subdivisions over on the East Bench. particularly the Emerald Ridge subdivision, which is just to the east of Lake Helena Drive, north of York Road. That subdivision has 67 lots, only 50 of which have been built, in part because of the water problems. Those 50 homes have dropped their water table up to 10 feet a year. And the conclusion of the hydrologist who has done extensive analysis here indicated that, quote, withdrawal of groundwater from this aquifer represents a non-sustainable source which is unlikely to continue to provide sufficient yields even for domestic wells for the long-term future. And they're looking at the scenario that within another 10 years, none of those homes will have water. And one of the options that they'll need to be looking at is trucking it in. So some new subdivisions in the East Valley have been draining their aquifers, and they believe the reason is that those aquifers are so deep and so lined that they just are not able to receive recharge, and so they're basically mining their water and running out of it. The areas around the Helena Valley Aquifer that we're proposing in developing a plan for this area under the growth policy is to look at the fact that outside of the Helena Valley Aquifer, which is shown there in blue, everything in pink there is constrained by actual water shortages or by an unknown water availability. And our key point on water, the last one, is that there is a clear need to consider additional growth management policies to address the shortcomings in the current planning programs. Moving on to wastewater, in conjunction with the consideration of pulling water out of the aquifers for drinking purposes, the reality is that all of the homes built out there, their wastewater is hopefully treated in their septic systems and goes back down into that very water supply from which they're drawing their water. And so that is an obvious concern. And that photo shows you one of the many large private community, technically they're called public under Montana law, but they're actually private wastewater systems serving multiple homes. We see that there are indications, they're not categorical studies that prove and without a total understanding, but there are indications from groundwater testing that population growth in the area has increased the loading of wastewater to the aquifers, stressing the capacity of the natural systems to mitigate water quality impacts. Of particular concern are the aging individual septic systems and the non-municipal wastewater systems and the proliferation of newer ones over the drinking water supplies. And again, that creates a need to provide active oversight and management of such systems. And the classic case, and it is an extreme one, is the 10 Mile Creek Pleasant Valley Estates subdivision, which just last year finally came up with a plan to fix the lagoon system that was built back in the 1970s. Over here on the right of the photo, serves about 300 homes in these two subdivisions. And that lagoon system was only about 50% built, and it was only treating about 25% of the wastewater that was coming out of these developments. The DEQ discovered that after decades and filed lawsuits against the owner of the wastewater system. The homeowners were caught in the middle of those lawsuits, and it ended up pulling the ownership and operation, and they formed a wastewater district and are now looking at investing over $5 million to try to fix that situation. It was not properly installed, and it was not properly maintained, and there was no oversight for decades to conclude that. Now again, that's a very extreme example and an isolated case, but we have had other indications that other wastewater systems are not being properly managed, and some of them, and a few have actually come to our attention, where in Applegate Village was one example where people complained of the raw sewage in their backyards, and the environmental health conducted an investigation and determined it. And one of their concerns is that they don't know exactly what's going on out there with all of these systems. So we see from a wastewater management standpoint a need for continuing the individual septic maintenance program, expanding it to include those non-municipal sewer systems, and another part of accommodating growth within the valley is to work with the City of Helena and East Helena to extend their municipal sewers and all of those measures are needed to accommodate growth while protecting groundwater supplies. Moving on, actually, and in particular, from the wastewater standpoint, are those areas of the valley where there is high groundwater, and that's more susceptible to problems, and shown in blue on this map. Moving on to roads, which is obviously a prominent issue these days. Our assessment of that whole situation is that much of the road network of Helena Valley was not designed to accommodate hundreds of new subdivisions with thousands of homes. And the reality is that there are no resources, either in the public sector or the private sector, to rebuild all of those roads. So we've done kind of an inventory of the gravel road network. This is one example where subdivisions were proposed on this road, and the developer obviously doesn't want to pay to improve it, and the county has no money to improve it, and so we get into these no-win situations. But there are also paved roads within, shown on the lower right, and there's a system that you can use to evaluate that road, and that road is falling apart. It needs to be totally reconstructed. And again, when a major development comes in proposed on that road, it has to be addressed, but there are no resources to do so. The county has no effective long-range or short-range planning tools to respond to the needs of the road network to accommodate growth and development. We currently have a system of what they call proportional share, where a developer comes in and, depending on the percentage of increase of traffic he has on a gravel road like this, he has to pay a proportional share of the $1 million per mile cost to rebuild that to the county standard. And the problem with the system that we have is that unless all of the land develops at once and every parcel there and every subdivision there pays its proportional share, the matching funds to complete the project don't happen, and that it could be decades or more before there's enough money to meet the standard that's applied in our subdivision regulations. The county desperately needs a system in place that will maximize the efficiency of the existing transportation system and also effectively accommodate projected growth. And this map shows those areas of the Helena Valley area that anything in color is, other than the cities, which you see in gray, anything outside of the cities that is either darker pink, light pink, or brown are roads that do not have the capacity, are in such a condition that we have to come up with a plan for how to deal with growth on those roads. The next key issue is fire protection, and you mentioned, Commissioner Hunthausen, how New Jersey had a real blazing inferno just yesterday. Well, in 2012, just before I came to town, the Corral Fire in June of 2012 started in a new subdivision, and you can see this graphic shows where the fire was. Started in a house up here on the south side of the scratch gravels, went up over the top, spread along it, and then jumped down into the valley. Here's a picture from the time on the news. Coming down into the valley, burned 4 homes completely, burned 2,000 acres, and started going out into the valley, jumped the canal, jumped Green Meadow Drive, and would have continued if the wind had not blown back on itself. And that's how they got it under control. Areas of high and high to extreme fuel hazard represent a constraint to development in what's known as the wildland-urban interface. And what we're learning is that the wildland-urban interface is the entire valley, because the sparks from those types of wildfires with 75-mile-an-hour winds can blow 4 miles, according to the fire experts. So the whole area is of concern. Just in the paper this past weekend, an issue that we've been talking about with the local fire districts. The article was about the city of Helena's fire department being stretched thin by growth within the city. And their pie chart that they included shows that, and you can't really see it, but if you look at the paper, you'll see that they had 41 actual fires last year in the city of Helena that they responded to, but there were almost 3,000 medical calls that the fire department responded to, and their emergency medical personnel. And as we went out and talked to the local fire chiefs, we learned that from one of them, he described a call where out in the county, A lone staff person at a nursing home called 911 because a patient had fallen and the staff person couldn't get them off the floor alone. This call activated 20 volunteers in the middle of the night. And what's happening is the same situation for the city. Remember, there are now as many people living out in the valley as there are in the city, and they have even less resources to respond to these emergency calls. And the National Association of Volunteer Firefighters warns that as communities grow, it becomes more and more difficult to recruit volunteers. The third issue that we looked at is the fact that when they do get the calls, what resources do they have to respond with? And in the case of fires, the volunteer rural fire departments protect a population of the size of Helena scattered over nearly 400 square miles with less than 200 fire hydrants or water pumping sources. By contrast, the city of Helena has over 1,600 fire hydrants located within a much smaller area, and all of those hydrants are located within a maximum of 1,000 feet from the from the buildings they have to serve. And out in the county, it can be miles and miles, and what they end up having to do is to convoy tank trucks to those limited water sources in order to be able to respond to the fires. And that's an obvious challenge. Another challenge is that our key point number 5 under this topic is that poorly designed, high-density subdivisions with narrow streets and small lots exacerbate the difficulties for rural volunteer fire companies. As one of the fire chiefs said, the density is killing us. And they're concerned that in these high-density subdivisions where they have to truck in water, if a major fire event comes, they have two problems. Number one, they can't evacuate. They can't get people in because of the on-street parking with the narrow roads that are allowed in those subdivisions. By contrast with the photo on the right, which shows in the city, when they have high density, they require wider streets to accommodate on-street parking. So that's an issue that we heard about. This map represents obviously those high fire hazard areas in the darker shades, but the reality is that virtually all of the Helena area Helena Valley planning area is constrained for fire protection because of the limited resources of the rural fire protection districts. Finally, the fifth key issue that we looked at and added as a result of the public participation process is flooding. Our key point number 1 in this chapter is development in flood-prone areas is expensive, costing millions in damages during floods and millions to mitigate in order to reduce damage. This is a air photo taken from 1981 flood, which was a 500-year severity event, kind of like similar to the one that occurred in Boulder, Colorado last year, if you might remember from the news, wiping out entire communities over there. And it shows how that water flows down through all of the subdivisions that were in existence in 1981, and more development has been added since that time in those areas. This shows on the left flooding that occurred in 2011. There was a 20-year plus flood. This is a home right near 10 Mile Creek, and you can imagine being in that house when the creek is raging by. But even in just normal years with spring melt, on the right photo you can see on an area near McHugh Lane, flooding occurs and we have to pass out the sandbags, and it's an every year concern, not just in those major storm events. And current regulations don't prevent development in areas subject to flooding in severe storms. They do require some mitigation in terms of elevating the floor level of the house, but they really don't stop or effectively control the development in those areas. And the current growth policies of both Helena and the county designate certain portions of the 10 Mile Creek floodplain for urban expansion. And this map shows primarily it's 10 Mile Creek, although Prickly Pear Creek obviously does have some flooding issues right through the center of town. Silver Creek as well actually was replaced by subdivisions at certain areas. So we just think there's a real need to look at this in terms of the growth policy. We did adopt a plan to have an extensive public participation process going through this information. The planning board staff and consultants laid out a multi-pronged and multi-phase campaign to maximize public input in the preparation of this report that we're presenting today. Our public participation included 13 meetings with stakeholder groups and consultations with individuals from 3 more groups within the community. We prepared a 4-page brochure that laid out, just at an initial stage, some of these issues on the major points that we've talked about. We mailed a survey to over 10,000 households within the valley, and of those, we got almost 3,000 responded for a very high response rate of 29%. A third of those actually included written comments on these issues and other issues. We did a quantitative analysis of about 30 questions that we asked on these issues, but we also did a qualitative analysis using what they call a word cloud, where we went through all of those written comments, typed them all in, did a word search for words within those that relate to development issues, and by counting the number of times you get a hit on a word, you can tell how important it is because more people are talking about it. And you can see roads was the top issue of concern with people. We did a series of outreach meetings within the valley, open houses, where we wanted to give people an opportunity to get more information on these issues than we could include in the survey, and also give an opportunity for face-to-face discussions with planning board members and planning staff. Unfortunately, those were very sparsely attended, but we're not stopping the process. What we intend to do is take this report back out to all of the stakeholder groups. We've already circulated it within county departments and some state agencies that deal with these issues. We've made revisions to the report already based on that input, and the next step is to go out to the stakeholder groups and get input on it. Ultimately, we're going to go forward with recommendations for policy change. And we are absolutely convinced that the recommendations of the 2004 growth policy for Helena Valley have had little, if any, effect on the development that has occurred here over the past decade. There are 5 major constraints to new development that must be addressed in the growth policy to ensure that orderly development and safe development can occur. We need a new way of doing the business of managing growth that addresses future costs and consequences of ignoring those development constraints. One of the options we are going to put forward is public investment in water and wastewater systems, road improvements, and fire services. That's one way to address the development constraints, but it's obviously very expensive, and there are risks that if you invest in roads to improve it for accommodate development, there's no land use control that says that's where development is going to happen, and you could have development happen in areas where you don't invest in your infrastructure. Zoning is one issue that we can look at in terms of controlling those development densities according to these constraints, but one of the things you'll hear from some stakeholders is that it increases the housing costs and reduces construction flexibility, and that is true. But it's equally true that we have subdivision regulations that are trying to do the same thing of mitigating these impacts. And zoning is really more effective, a more effective way to address constraints than project-by-project subdivision reviews. Ultimately, we see that a combination of public investment, zoning, improving our subdivision regulations, and education are really needed to effectively manage growth in the Helena Valley planning area. So in conclusion, we see that 95% of the county population, and correspondingly 98% of its development activity, is happening in Helena Valley. That conservative estimates are that we will add 10,000 people and 4,000 new housing units in the next 20 years. The current recommendations of the growth policy for urban, rural, and urban, rural, and transitional areas haven't addressed those key issues, and we must look for new ways to deal with the growth challenges ahead. We are hoping that by the end of June, we will have adopted a Helena Valley area plan as an amendment to the growth policy that will, number one, effectively respond to those constraints of water, wastewater, roads, fire protection, and flooding, that will provide multiple policy options, that has flexibility to meet market needs, and that offers trade-offs where it's harder to do projects that saddle taxpayers with unfunded liabilities and make it easier to do projects that recognize and work within those development constraints. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions because I'm sure that stimulated some.
Thank you very much. Great presentation, George. Appreciate it. Commissioner, you want to fire away first? And
Gosh. I've been thinking for quite some time about taking the very long view here in Lewis and Clark County vis-a-vis development. And with the projection that between 7 and 17,000 people are coming in, let's say 10, where are we going to put them? That's really the big question. And so as I look at our 5 pillars, water, wastewater, fire, roads, and flood, it's challenging to figure out where the best place for development might be, because you might be in good shape for fire, but you wouldn't be in good shape for flooding. So exactly where the most optimum place to develop or build is a huge, huge question. And so that's what I guess I don't have a question, but that is my observation. If I were a person who were going to be interested in moving into Lewis and Clark County and into this valley, where would I want to build my house, which for most people is their main investment in their life? So, I mean, it's hard because it might be good on one of our pillars, you might be good on roads, you might have a great road, but you might not have much for water. So how can people or developers even to guess where they might go?
Well, let me just give you a couple of observations of what happens in the real world. First, land doesn't get developed unless it's for sale. So one factor that determines where development is proposed is what land is for sale. And that land being for sale has nothing to do with any of these development constraints. It's just a landowner that wants to sell their land for whatever personal purposes they need the revenues. Secondly, people decide where they want to live, not based primarily on these development constraints again. What they're looking at is, do I want to live in the city? Do I want to live in the valley? Do I want to have a small lot in an urban environment, or do I want to have a large lot where my kids can play in the play ball in the backyard? Schools, obviously, is another. So there's this list of, and cost, there's this list of criteria that people look at, and I think probably they finally get down to the road condition. They probably don't think about fire protection that much, just assuming that it's going to be there when they need it. Similarly, they assume that if a subdivision is approved by the county planning board and the Board of County Commissioners, water is a certainty. So these are very kind of peripheral issues that actually come to the forefront every once in a while, and down the road when the dollars come due for fixing the roads or all of these other issues. And the farther out we get, the harder and more expensive it gets to deal with them. So there's no good answer to the question of why people build where they do, but there are some compelling factors that are not in the list of 5 key issues.
Follow up. I guess I don't disagree with that, and I guess I probably didn't phrase that question very well, but my point is, when these people come, where I understand that they can only develop on land that's for sale, but
The real question is, what should the county's policy be on these matters?
yeah, because
Should it
you're
just
right.
be
I
a
mean,
matter
all
of
these people assume
wherever land
that
is
the county
available,
has
that's
taken
where
care of it.
development's going to occur. That's one option. And that's the option that the county's been following, just simply relying upon the DEQ rules for wastewater and water to determine where development happens and how much of it happens. That's the guiding principle that we have right now. And it doesn't address other issues. It doesn't address roads. It doesn't address fire protection. It only addresses water. And it doesn't do an effective job of that.
Right. And
Go ahead.
Madam Chair, if I could, I think that along with that discussion, that this is great. I mean, I'm really excited about this because I think these are the issues we need to be talking about, and this is the direction we need to head. And to kind of answer Commissioner's question, I think a good growth policy guides our guides our policymaking, which are the management tools that we use to guide growth. So someone coming into the community, if we have a good growth policy in our on-the-ground policies, subdivision regulations, zoning, and those kinds of things are based on that policy, which has addressed these 5 pillars, then that will help guide or incentivize where growth happens, because it will happen in those places that make the most sense and that we've addressed through zoning and those kinds of things.
The common denominator on all 5 issues is density. And you need to have urban density and suburban density in areas where there are a lack of constraints and where there are facilities and services available to cost-effectively support that development. In rural areas, you need to have low-density development, which has been the history of Montana. Some of these areas, like out north of Lincoln Road, were ranches up until 20 years ago.
Right.
And they've been sequentially cut off into more and more development, some of them into urban development that is similar to anything you see right here in the city of Helena.
So I have a couple of just questions or things I want you to comment on. You know, as you were talking and talking about I'll call them the 5 pillars. I think that's how you described them, right?
No, that's how you guys
Oh, we
describe it.
described them.
I call them the 5 key issues.
5 key issues. That's better. The 5 key issues. It sounds like, well, it's obvious to me that water availability, which is in the bottom of the bathtub, the bottom of our valley, and flood issues collide. It makes sense that growth happened there in terms of water availability, but it doesn't make sense in terms of flood issues.
In limited portions of that, obviously. The 10 Mile Creek floodplain is the most notable. But there are large areas of the Helena Valley aquifer area that do not have flooding problems.
Right, but it is something that,
They do overlap.
yeah, right,
definitely.
has to be identified.
Mhm.
And the same with the urban growth boundary that we've identified with the city of Helena and the flood issues. They collide as well. So there
Yes.
are areas in that
Yep.
urban growth boundary that make sense, but there are areas that are in the floodplain as well.
And just understand, we're not talking about completely changing the direction. The 2004 growth policy calls for urban areas, calls for transitional or suburban areas, and it calls for rural areas, and it calls for appropriate development in all 3 areas. It just hasn't happened because the growth policy doesn't call for the tools to really make it happen.
Right. So I guess, if you have anything more to say about those conflicts for the people that might be listening. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you is how this growth policy in its final version, how it will dovetail with, or has potential to dovetail with the City of Helena, City of East Helena's growth policy.
Well, as a matter of fact,
About that.
2 weeks, in 2 weeks, we're going to be doing a project with the City of Helena for the urban standards boundary. They don't really call it, and it's not really an urban growth boundary, it's an urban standards boundary. They're looking at where they're going to extend utilities, mostly to existing development, but also to new development. That's what their policy is predicated upon. But the city and the county have entered into a memorandum of understanding to work together on facilitating. This isn't about stopping development, it's about facilitating development in areas where there are the facilities and services to make it cost-effective to accommodate high levels of development.
Right.
So it's limiting growth in areas that don't have those services, but it's increasing growth and development in those areas that do have the services, because that's the best place to have the development happen. So we're bringing in a team of planning professionals from around the country, volunteers, members, experts from the American Planning Association are coming in for a week, the first week of February. And we're going to be doing, first, an orientation for them, showing them the challenges of the urban standards boundary and the neighborhoods that are just outside the city that that need water and sewer, but don't have the roads and other infrastructure to really meet the needs of an urban situation. Developers are coming in around the periphery, and some of them are going in with individual wells and community wastewater systems within a stone's throw of the public utilities because they can't afford the cost of building their subdivision with all of its infrastructure and then extending the water and sewer. So there's a real need to look at these situations, look at the challenges, but look at also at the opportunities and come up with a way to get everybody on the same proverbial page and working together to really see the growth happen where it needs to happen. So we are actually working with the city on that project, and whatever comes out of that is going to go right into this growth policy update, as part of our plan to respond to the growth challenges.
Mr. Chairman, the other thing I have a lot of interest in is on the fire issue. And it is very clear that it is a huge challenge to recruit and retain volunteer firefighters. And I think that people, on the whole, do not realize the value of these volunteers. And the example that you gave about getting, having 20 volunteers, I'm married to one of them, by the way. Because a nursing home resident has 20 volunteers getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, everybody, going to respond. Clearly, there needs to be some more effort towards recruitment and retention, but it is an enormous challenge because our society is so busy with other things and so distracted that spirit of volunteerism sometimes is languishing. But the monetary value that these volunteers contribute is substantial. And so I think that as a county, we need to look how we can incentivize people to participate, but to put a dollar value on what it is that they do, and maybe look at that as development occurs about how, because the people who stand to benefit are people who are developers and people who are purchasing, homes. And so I just think that is something that we haven't talked a lot about, but we need to have a tremendous amount of attention that's focused on that. And I don't know the answers, but I do know that we need to get more volunteers, and there needs maybe to be more training about when you call 911, maybe some work with dispatchers so that they don't call out the volunteer fire departments to respond to that.
Obviously, trying to do everything you can to improve recruitment of volunteers is part of the issue. Public investment in giving them the resources they need to do their job is another big part of it. The reality is the challenge that they have, not just in terms of the calls that they receive, but trying to fight fires with very limited water supplies and long distances that they have to go over. And the more development that you have in those areas, the harder the challenge becomes. So that's the long range. All of these are pieces of the long range picture that are very troubling and very difficult to come up with.
And actually, they have tremendous resources in their fire trucks and their equipment. It's a lot of it. These volunteer fire departments have very sophisticated equipment, state of the art. Even in Augusta, where I live, it's amazing what we have. But my husband, at the age of 61, is not the oldest member of the Augusta Volunteer Fire Department.
Yeah.
And that's the situation with many of these volunteer fire departments across the entire state, is that those guys they're getting old. And so we need to, encourage more young people to participate. And maybe that's something that the county could look at, or maybe some effort within the school system to encourage some of those young guys, and women, by the way. We've got some great female firefighters, to become interested in that. But I mean, it's going to take a concerted effort. That's all.
Thank you. Very good. So, George, again, thank you very much. It's been an excellent presentation, great information. I hope that there are people watching out there and listening, and I hope people will get involved and give you feedback. I'm excited that you're also going out, taking this out to stakeholder groups and working.
That's the next
Community,
step in the
right.
process.
We as a county need to be good listeners as well, and I think we're doing a good job at that in this. And I also want to thank those that have contributed to this, so the Water Quality Protection District and your planning staff, legal staff that have contributed to this document and the information that you've put together. Really
And
appreciate
the planning board members have been guiding us with fear and trepidation.
the planning board members. Great. Yes. So, thank you. So, before you run away, though, maybe you step aside. I don't know if there's public comment or questions that we have mostly staff, others in the crowd, but please come forward if you have any questions or comments that you want to contribute. Anything from the gallery over here? No, you guys are okay. All right. So thank you again, George. Appreciate it. Commissioner, anything further?
Nope, but I appreciate everybody's effort on this, and we just need to keep taking the long view, and that's the big challenge.
Absolutely. Mr. Naubert, thank you too for being here and helping inform the public about these issues. Appreciate it. All right, well, we will get off that if there's no more public input. And we will move to the final agenda item, which is any public comment that anyone has that is not on our agenda today but is under the jurisdiction of the commission. Any public comment? Any staff comment? All right, hearing none, we will stand adjourned. Thank you very much.